The plane wheels hit the runway with a soft jolt, and Matthew glanced at Emily. She was looking out the window, her face half-lit by the glow of the Hawaiian sun. Her lips curved into a faint smile, but it wasn't the kind that reached her eyes. It had been months since he'd seen her truly happy. He hoped this trip might change that. "Welcome to paradise," he said, squeezing her hand. "Yeah," she replied a bit too softly. The ride to the resort was postcard perfect. Waves rolling lazily onto white sand, palm trees swaying against a cerulean sky. They arrived at the Kailua Beach Resort, a 5-star slice of heaven, where the staff greeted them with leis and glasses of champagne. Matthew tried to match their enthusiasm. "This is amazing, right?" he asked, his voice tinged with hope. Emily smiled. "It's beautiful." But her phone buzzed in her bag, and she fished it out quickly, her fingers tapping the screen. The moment slipped through Matthew's grasp like sand. That night, they dined at the resort's upscale restaurant, Ocean Bliss. The table was perched on the edge of a deck overlooking the water, the sound of waves mixing with soft jazz. Matthew had been looking forward to this. Time alone with Emily. No work emails, no distractions. He began, "I was thinking about that time we came to the Keys after college. Remember that little beachside motel?" Emily smiled briefly, but her eyes flicked toward her phone, which was face down on the table. "I do. We ate key lime pie every night, didn't we? And I got sick after the third night," he said, laughing. "You told me to quit while I was ahead." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "You never listen." Her phone buzzed again, and she glanced at it, biting her lip. "You can get that if you need to," Matthew said, trying to sound casual. "It's nothing," she replied, flipping it silent. "Just work stuff." Matthew's stomach tightened. She worked in marketing. Nothing urgent should be following her to Maui. He let it go, but the thought lingered like a shadow over their evening. The next few days were a mix of paradise and unease. They went snorkeling and explored hidden coves, moments that felt like old times. But then there were Emily's solo walks at sunset, her frequent use of headphones, and her reluctance to join him at the pool or beach some afternoons. On the third evening, after returning from a solo outing, Emily seemed lighter, more carefree. She showered, dressed in a floral sundress, and even suggested dinner at a nearby tiki bar. Matthew latched onto her enthusiasm like a drowning man reaching for a life raft. The tiki bar was crowded, lively with ukulele music and laughter. Emily ordered a Mai Tai, her eyes sparkling for the first time in days. Matthew leaned in, savoring the moment. "This is nice," he said. "It is," she agreed, her hand brushing his across the table. But then a bartender, a young man with a sun-kissed face and easy charm, walked by and gave Emily a knowing smile. She glanced at Matthew, her smile faltering, then quickly looked away. Something twisted in Matthew's gut. He'd noticed the man earlier, watching them from behind the bar, but he'd brushed it off. Now the pieces weren't fitting together. That night, Emily fell asleep quickly, her phone charging on the nightstand. Matthew stared at it, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. He hated the thought even as it formed. He trusted her, or at least he thought he did. But the bartender's smile, the distracted looks, the work messages, they painted a picture he didn't want to see. His heart raced as he picked up the phone. It was unlocked, the screen opened to a text thread. For a moment he hesitated. This was a violation of her privacy, a line he'd sworn never to cross. But the buzzing in his head was deafening, and his hand moved on its own. The messages were with someone named Jay. "Jay, can't stop thinking about you. Last night was incredible. Emily, me too. Wish I could sneak away again tomorrow." Matthew's breath hitched. He scrolled further, his hands trembling. There were photos, not explicit but intimate. A selfie of Emily in her sundress, the same one from the tiki bar. Another of her smiling at the camera, her hair wet, taken at a beach he didn't recognize. He put the phone down, his chest heaving. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. He looked at Emily, her face peaceful in sleep, as if nothing were wrong. But everything was wrong. The next morning, Matthew woke up to the sound of seagulls outside their balcony. For a moment, he lay still, his chest heavy with the weight of what he'd uncovered the night before. Emily was already up, standing at the window in a robe, sipping coffee. She turned and smiled when she saw him stir. "Good morning," she said, her voice breezy, as if the world were as calm as the ocean outside. "Morning," he replied, sitting up. His throat felt dry. He studied her as she moved around the room, humming softly. There was no hint of guilt or remorse in her demeanor. She looked like the woman he'd married, beautiful, confident, and untouchable. But now he knew there were parts of her life he couldn't reach. She left for a morning yoga session while Matthew stayed behind, nursing a coffee on the balcony. Her phone was charging on the nightstand again. This time, she hadn't turned off notifications. It buzzed once, then again. His hands itched, but his mind was already made up. He picked up the phone and opened the messages. "Jay, morning, beautiful. Did you sleep okay? Jay, I can't stop thinking about you. Meet me at Hannah Cove later?" Matthew's stomach churned as he read the words. Hannah Cove was a small, secluded beach they'd passed during a boat tour, perfect for privacy. He scrolled further back, piecing together the affair from the fragments in the texts. It had started months ago with innocent conversations about shared interests. Then the tone shifted, becoming flirtatious, then explicit. They'd met several times before the trip, and now they were using this vacation, his vacation to steal more moments together. Matthew gripped the phone, his knuckles white. He wanted to smash it, confront her, demand answers. But he stopped himself. If he acted now, she could deny it, twist the truth. He needed more than messages. Emily returned from yoga in high spirits, her cheeks flushed. "You should have come with me," she said, dropping her mat on the floor. "It was incredible. The instructor was amazing." "Maybe tomorrow," he replied, forcing a smile. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yeah, just tired." She nodded and kissed his forehead, her lips warm against his skin. The gesture felt hollow now, like a mask hiding something ugly. That afternoon, Matthew decided to play along. "Why don't you take some time for yourself today?" he suggested over lunch. "You've been wanting to check out those art galleries downtown, right?" Emily hesitated, her fork pausing mid-air. "Are you sure? I don't want to leave you alone." "I'll be fine," he said, keeping his tone light. "Go have fun." She smiled, relieved. "Okay, but I won't be gone long." Matthew waited until she left before following her. He kept a safe distance, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap to blend in. His heart pounded as he watched her head toward the parking lot, her pace quick, purposeful. She didn't go downtown. Instead, she drove toward Hannah Cove, her movements rehearsed, as if this wasn't her first time sneaking off. Matthew parked a quarter-mile away and walked the rest, his chest tightening with every step. The cove was quiet, hidden by cliffs and palm trees. From a distance, he saw her. Emily stood by a large rock near the water, her posture relaxed, her face lit by a smile he hadn't seen in months. A tall, broad-shouldered man approached, his blonde hair catching the sunlight. "Jay." Matthew froze, the scene unfolding like a nightmare. Jay wrapped his arms around Emily, pulling her into a kiss so passionate it made Matthew's stomach turn. He didn't know how long he stood there, rooted to the spot, watching them. Time felt meaningless, his mind a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Finally, he turned and walked back to the car, each step heavier than the last. That evening, Emily returned to the hotel looking radiant. "How were the galleries?" Matthew asked, his voice calm, almost too calm. She hesitated, just a beat too long. "They were great. Lots of beautiful pieces. You would have liked it." Her lie hung in the air, suffocating him. But he didn't challenge her, not yet. Instead, he smiled and handed her a glass of wine. "To us," he said, raising his glass. "To us," she replied, clinking hers against his. As the glasses touched, Matthew's resolve hardened. He wasn't done. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Emily had fallen asleep again, her breathing soft and steady. Matthew sat on the balcony with a beer in hand, staring out at the moonlit ocean. His mind raced, replaying the scene at Hannah Cove. He thought about their marriage, the years they'd spent together, graduating college, building their careers, buying their first home. The late-night talks, the shared dreams of a family someday. It was as if those memories belonged to someone else now, someone naive and blissfully unaware of betrayal. He had to know the full truth. The next morning, Emily seemed completely at ease, moving through their shared routines as if nothing had changed. She even suggested a couple's massage at the spa. Matthew agreed, not because he wanted to, but because it gave him more time to think. As they lay side by side on massage tables, the scent of lavender in the air, Emily chatted with the therapist about the best beaches in Maui. Matthew stared at the ceiling, his chest tight. She sounded so normal, so unaffected. He wanted to reach across and ask, "Asterisk, who are you? Really? And who is Jay?" Asterisk later that day, while Emily went for another walk, Matthew started piecing things together. He remembered the text messages on her phone. Many of them referenced specific times and places, a restaurant in their hometown, a hotel he didn't recognize. He searched the name of the hotel on his own phone and found its location, only a 20-minute drive from their house. He scrolled back further, seeing mentions of gifts. Asterisk, thanks for the necklace. It's beautiful. Asterisk, Matthew didn't recall giving her a necklace in the past year. More messages referenced days he'd worked late. Those gaps now felt glaring, like holes in a story he hadn't known he was living. That evening, he suggested a quiet dinner at the resort's beachfront cafe. Emily looked stunning in a simple sundress, her hair loosely curled. Matthew could barely bring himself to look at her. "This is nice," she said, her smile warm. "I feel like we've needed this for a long time." "Yeah," Matthew replied, swirling his beer. "It's good to unplug." Her phone buzzed, and she reached for it instinctively before catching herself. "Sorry, just my sister." He said nothing, letting the lie hang between them. Back in the room, Matthew waited until Emily fell asleep before unlocking her phone again. He opened the photos and found more images. Selfies of her and Jay, some taken in places he didn't recognize. One photo showed them standing in front of a fountain lit with twinkling lights. Matthew's stomach dropped. He knew that fountain. It was at the Silver Lake Park back home, a spot he and Emily used to visit on warm evenings. The betrayal felt even more personal now, as if Jay had invaded sacred ground. Determined to get more answers, Matthew decided to confront Emily indirectly. The next morning, as they had breakfast by the pool, he brought up a story about a mutual friend. "Did you hear about Greg and Laura?" he asked casually, sipping his coffee. "No. What happened?" Emily replied, her tone neutral. "Laura found out Greg was seeing someone else. He was pretty sloppy about it. Left his phone unlocked one too many times." Emily's hand paused midair, the fork halfway to her mouth. Her expression flickered, just for a second, before she forced a smile. "Wow, that's awful," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I can't imagine what she's going through." Matthew nodded, studying her. "Yeah, it must be devastating to think you know someone so well, only to realize they're hiding something." Emily shifted in her seat, her eyes darting to her phone on the table. "Do you ever worry about that?" he asked, leaning forward. She blinked, startled. "What do you mean?" "I mean secrets. Do you think everyone has them?" Emily laughed nervously. "Well, I think everyone keeps little things to themselves. It doesn't mean they're hiding anything bad." Matthew smiled faintly. "I guess you're right." But his words carried a weight she couldn't ignore. Later that afternoon, Emily went to the spa for another solo appointment. Matthew decided to follow her again, his heart pounding as he tailed her discreetly. This time, she didn't go to the spa. She drove back to Hannah Cove. Matthew stayed hidden, watching as she met Jay by the water. They talked for a while, their body language relaxed, intimate. Then Jay reached for her hand, and they walked along the shoreline together, disappearing from view. Matthew clenched his fists, anger and heartbreak warring within him. That night, as Emily showered, Matthew sat at the desk in their room, staring at her phone. He had seen enough. The texts, the photos, the stolen moments, it was all there. When Emily emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a towel. She found Matthew sitting on the edge of the bed, her phone in his hand. Her eyes widened. "What are you doing with my phone?" Matthew looked up, his expression cold. "Who's Jay?" The color drained from her face. "Matthew, I don't," he said, his voice trembling with barely restrained anger. "Don't lie to me again." She took a step back, clutching the towel tightly around her. "I can explain." "Oh, I bet you can." He stood, the phone still in his hand. "But you'd better make it good, because I've seen everything. The messages, the photos, the meetings. You've been lying to me for months, Emily. Months." She opened her mouth, then closed it, tears welling in her eyes. "Say something," Matthew demanded, his voice cracking. "Anything." Emily sank onto the bed, her head in her hands. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. Matthew stood in front of her, the phone still in his hand, his knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. "Start talking," he said, his voice low and sharp. She wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. I didn't mean for it to happen." Matthew scoffed, pacing the room. "You didn't mean for it to happen? What does that even mean, Emily? You've been sneaking around with this guy for months. You planned this. He gestured wildly toward her phone. "This wasn't an accident." Emily flinched but said nothing. "Do you love him?" Matthew asked suddenly, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. Her head shot up. "No. God, no." "Then why?" The word burst out of him like a gunshot. "Why the hell would you risk everything we've built for this?" She buried her face in her hands. "I don't know," she murmured. "Bullshit," he snapped, slamming the phone onto the nightstand. The sound echoed through the room, making Emily jump. "You don't get to sit there and cry and say you don't know. You owe me more than that, Emily." She took a shaky breath, her shoulders heaving. "I was lonely, okay? You've been so busy with work. I felt like you didn't see me anymore." Matthew stared at her, stunned. "So this is my fault now? You cheat on me, and somehow I'm the bad guy because I was working." "I'm not saying that," she said quickly, her voice pleading. "I'm not. But it wasn't just about the work. It was everything. We stopped talking. We stopped." Her voice broke. "We stopped being us." Matthew laughed bitterly. "And what? You thought sleeping with some random guy was the solution? Did it fix everything? Emily, are you happy now?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. I'm not happy. I've been miserable, Matthew. I hate myself for what I've done." He sat down heavily on the chair by the window, staring out at the ocean. The view, so beautiful and serene, felt like a cruel joke. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant crash of waves. Finally, Matthew broke the silence. "How long has it been going on?" he asked, his voice flat. Emily hesitated, and he turned to glare at her. "Don't you dare lie to me." 6 months, she said quietly. Matthew's stomach churned. 6 months. Half a year of deceit, of stolen moments, of him living in blissful ignorance while she betrayed him. And how did it start? She hesitated again, but the look in his eyes told her there was no avoiding the question. "I met him at the gym," she said finally. "He was friendly. We started talking, and it just escalated." "Friendly?" Matthew repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "And you just couldn't help yourself, huh? One thing led to another, and suddenly, you're sneaking off to hotels and beaches." "I know how it sounds," she said, her voice breaking, "but it wasn't like that at first. We were just talking. I didn't mean for it to get physical. But it did." She nodded, her face crumpling with shame. Matthew leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Does he know about me?" Emily nodded again. "Yes, he knows I'm married." The sheer audacity of it all made Matthew's blood boil. "So he doesn't care either? Great. Just perfect." "Matthew, please," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But You're damn right you don't, he interrupted, his voice rising again. You don't deserve a single ounce of forgiveness. Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? She sobbed, clutching the edge of the bed.
I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't fix this, he said coldly. Sorry doesn't erase those messages, or the pictures, or the fact that you looked me in the eye every day and lied to me. The hours dragged on as they argued, the conversation cycling between anger, blame, and raw pain. Emily tried to explain herself, but every word she spoke felt like a dagger in Matthew's chest. Eventually, they both fell silent, drained from the emotional storm. Emily sat on the bed, her face pale and streaked with tears. Matthew stood by the window, staring out at the dark horizon. What happens now? Emily asked quietly. Matthew didn't turn around. I don't know. Do you? Do you want me to leave? He hesitated, his mind torn between love, betrayal, and the life they'd built together. I don't know, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. The night passed in tense, unbearable silence. Matthew lay awake, his mind racing with images of Emily and Jay together. He thought about the life they'd shared, the dreams they'd once had, and the broken pieces left in the wake of her betrayal. By the time the first rays of sunlight crept through the curtains, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The morning brought no relief. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating, as if it carried the weight of the words they'd hurled at each other the night before. Matthew sat on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the floor. Emily was in the bathroom, the sound of running water muffling her quiet sobs. He thought about leaving, just grabbing his bag, calling a cab, and heading straight for the airport. But the idea of running felt wrong. He needed answers, closure, something to make sense of the chaos swirling in his mind. When Emily emerged, her face was pale, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked at him hesitantly, as if she weren't sure if he would speak to her. Do you love me? Matthew asked suddenly, his voice raw. Her lips trembled. Yes, of course I do. Then why? He demanded, his voice cracking. Why wasn't I enough? Tears streamed down her face. It wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me. I was lost. I felt invisible, like I didn't matter anymore. Matthew scoffed, shaking his head. Invisible? You've always mattered, Emily. I built my life around you. How could you not see that? She stepped closer, her hands outstretched, but he recoiled. Please, she whispered. Let me explain. You've had months to explain, he snapped, cutting her off. Months where you could have told me how you felt, instead of sneaking around behind my back. Her hands dropped to her sides, defeated. I didn't know how to tell you. I was scared. Scared of what? That I'd stop loving you? Because congratulations, Emily. Now I don't even know who you are. The day dragged on in tense silence. They avoided each other, each retreating to separate corners of the resort. Matthew wandered aimlessly, his thoughts a chaotic mess. He passed happy couples lounging by the pool, sipping cocktails and laughing, and the sight felt like a cruel reminder of what he'd lost. At lunch, Emily found him sitting at the resort cafe, staring at an untouched plate of food. Can we talk? She asked softly. Matthew didn't look up. What else is there to say? A lot, she said, taking a seat across from him. I need you to understand that I never stopped loving you. What I did was selfish and horrible, but it wasn't because of anything you did. That doesn't make it better, he replied coldly. I know, she said, her voice breaking, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix this. Counseling, therapy, anything. I just need you to give me a chance. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Her face was a mix of desperation and guilt, her eyes pleading. A part of him wanted to believe her, to believe that they could somehow repair the damage. But another part of him, larger, louder, knew that some wounds couldn't be healed. That evening, they sat on the beach, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the water. Emily had suggested they talk somewhere neutral, away from the tension of their hotel room. I keep thinking about the first time we came to the beach together, Matthew said, breaking the silence. You wore that ridiculous floppy hat and spent the whole day chasing seagulls away from our snacks. Emily smiled faintly. You kept laughing at me, saying I looked like a cartoon character. I did, he said, his voice softening, and I loved every minute of it. Back then, it felt like nothing could touch us. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away. Do you know what hurts the most? He asked, his voice trembling. It's not just that you cheated. It's that you took what we had, every good memory, every happy moment, and made it feel fake. Like none of it was real. That's not true, she said quickly. Everything we had was real, Matthew. It still is. He shook his head, tears blurring his vision. I don't know if I can believe that anymore. The storm rolled in that night, heavy rain lashing against the windows of their room. It mirrored the chaos inside Matthew's heart. Emily sat across from him, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her world together. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, he replied honestly. Do you want me to leave? He hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on him. I don't know, he said again. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Matthew, I love you, she said, her voice cracking, and I hate myself for what I've done to you, to us, but I'm begging you, please don't give up on me, on us. He looked at her, his heart aching with a mix of love and pain. I need time, he said finally. I can't make a decision right now. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes. But even as she spoke, Matthew wasn't sure if time would be enough to mend what had been broken. The storm raged on through the night, but by morning, the skies had cleared. As the first rays of sunlight spilled into the room, Matthew made a decision, not about their future, but about his own. He needed space, he needed clarity, and he needed to find himself again. Outside of the shadow of Emily's betrayal, the sunrise cast a warm golden glow across the resort, its light creeping through the curtains and landing softly on Matthew's face. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at his packed suitcase. Every detail of the room, the textured walls, the faint smell of coconut oil, the muffled sound of the waves outside, felt heightened, like the world was daring him to remember this place. Behind him, Emily stirred. Are you really leaving? She asked, her voice hoarse from crying. Matthew turned to look at her. She was still wrapped in the blanket, her eyes red and swollen. I need time, he said, his tone resolute but not unkind. Emily nodded slowly, her lips trembling. Do you want me to go, too? I don't care what you do, he said, then sighed. That's not true. I don't know what I want you to do, but I need to figure out what's next for me. And I can't do that here. Not with you. Her tears started again, silent but steady. I understand, she whispered. The drive to the airport was surreal. Emily had insisted on dropping him off, and he hadn't protested. The car was silent except for the soft hum of the engine. She kept glancing at him, as if trying to memorize his face. When they reached the curb, she pulled over and parked. Matthew hesitated before getting out. Take care of yourself, Emily, he said, his voice softer than he expected. You too, she replied, her voice breaking. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them. Then, without another word, Matthew grabbed his bag and walked into the terminal. The flight home felt endless. Matthew spent most of it staring out the window, his thoughts a jumble of anger, sadness, and faint glimmers of hope. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The life he'd shared with Emily, the life he thought was unshakable, was gone. When he landed, the cool evening air greeted him like a wake-up call. He took a cab home, the city lights blurring past the window. The house felt different when he walked in. Quiet, still. He dropped his bag by the door and stood in the living room, taking it all in. This was his space now, for better or worse. The days that followed were a mix of numbness and tentative steps forward. Matthew returned to work, throwing himself into projects to keep his mind occupied. He avoided mutual friends and family, not ready to face their questions. But he also started doing things he hadn't done in years, going for long runs, cooking elaborate meals, even picking up his guitar for the first time since college. Slowly, he began to feel like himself again, though the pain lingered like a shadow. Emily called a few times, leaving messages that he couldn't bring himself to listen to. Instead, he let her words live in the unanswered text she sent. "I'm sorry. I miss you. I hope you're okay." One evening, a few weeks after he'd returned, Matthew found himself sitting on the back porch with a glass of whiskey in hand. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. He thought about Emily, about Jay, about everything that had happened. The anger had started to dull, replaced by a quiet sadness. But there was something else, too. Something he hadn't expected. Hope. It wasn't for reconciliation. He didn't know if that would ever be possible. It was hope for himself, for the person he was rediscovering. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to smile just a little. Months later, Matthew found himself in a cafe downtown, flipping through a book while sipping a latte. A woman sitting nearby caught his eye. She was reading too, her glasses perched on her nose, her curly hair spilling over her shoulders. She looked up and smiled, and something in her expression, warm, open, unguarded, struck him. "Good book?" he asked, gesturing to her novel. She laughed softly. "It's a little dense, but I like it." He nodded, his own smile widening. For the first time in a long time, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter. Life was moving forward. Matthew never heard from Jay again. Emily continued to reach out for a while, but eventually her messages stopped. They never officially closed the chapter on their marriage, but in his heart, Matthew knew it was over. It wasn't the ending he had imagined when he stood at the altar years ago, looking into Emily's eyes, but it was the ending he had, and somehow that was enough.